Have you ever built a life so carefully, only to realize you were living inside a fortress instead of a home? Gregory Langford was a man the world admired and feared, a billionaire CEO known as the Ice King of Chicago. He controlled boardrooms with a stare and made empires rise with a signature. But behind that power was silence, the kind that settles in after loss, the kind that money cannot erase. And then Clara Jennings walked in, a temporary secretary, a grieving mother, a woman who had lost her son, and with him, the life she once knew. Now imagine this. What would you do if someone like her quietly showed you the cracks in everything you thought was unshakable? Would you shut her out or let her in and risk feeling again? This is not a love story. It's a story about healing through quiet courage, unseen kindness, and the power of simply being there. If you find this story touching, comment 1. If you think this video needs improvement, comment 2. Now, take a deep breath, and let me tell you the story of Clara and Gregory. The elevator chimed on the 60th floor with a soft ding, but no one looked up. Not from their desks, not from behind their computer screens. You didn't look up when the doors opened, not on this floor. This was the executive level of Langford Capital, perched high above the streets of downtown Chicago, where the air felt colder, not because of the altitude, but because of Gregory Langford himself. Here, silence wasn't just expected, it was policy. Employees often joked quietly, in private, never in writing, that no one on the 60th floor spoke more than 10 words to Gregory at a time. 11, and you might not be seen the next morning. He was 45, clean-shaven, always in navy or black, his cufflinks matching the metal trim on his Mont Blanc pen. The kind of man who didn't just demand perfection, he measured it, managed it, expected it in every breath. The Ice King of Chicago, the media called him, not because he was ruthless, though he was, not because he was wealthy, though Forbes ranked him among the top 50 under 50, but because he never flinched, never faltered, never warmed. In boardrooms, his voice cut through conversation like a scalpel. In the press, he was poised, sharp, untouchable. Employees feared him, competitors envied him, investors adored him, and Gregory Langford liked it that way. That Tuesday morning began like any other. His assistant, Madison, had quit the week before an abrupt departure, citing stress-related health issues. No one questioned it. People didn't stay long in the seat closest to Gregory Langford. His new temp secretary arrived at 8:01 a.m. She came alone. No grand entrance, no smile of someone trying to impress. Just a quiet knock on the glass of his office door, and then a woman with auburn brown hair pulled into a neat bun walked in, holding a small leather notebook and a thermos that looked like it had seen better years. "Clara Jennings," she said, extending her hand, her voice calm, composed. Gregory glanced up from his monitor. She was younger than he expected, maybe mid-30s. Her clothes weren't flashy. No designer label, no statement jewelry, just a plain cream blouse and a slate gray skirt. Simple, efficient, forgettable. He barely acknowledged her before returning to his screen. Start with the inbox. Madison left it a mess. Clara nodded once. No smile, no flinch, no fear. She simply walked out and sat at the desk outside his glass office. Just like that. What Gregory didn't notice not yet was the small pause she took as she sat. The kind of pause that came not from hesitation, but from a person quietly cataloging everything around them. Details, rhythm, tone. He wouldn't recognize that habit until much later. What the others did notice, however, was that she didn't seem nervous. Not like the rest of them. Not like the junior analyst who once cried in the bathroom after Gregory called her report lazy. Not like the VP who fumbled his tablet during a quarterly briefing. Clara Jennings didn't fidget, didn't stammer, didn't try to make friends. She simply listened, typed, filed, observed, and it unsettled people more than they were willing to admit. Gregory didn't look at her twice that day. He dictated, she typed. He dropped off marked-up documents. She scanned and refiled. No chatter, no questions. But in the quiet hours between meetings, something began to shift. Gregory, in his silence, noticed the absence of something. No interruptions, no passive-aggressive sighs, no perfume too strong, no desperate attempts to impress, just peace. And for a man who had built his life on power and noise, that quiet unnerved him, more than he'd admit. At 4:03 p.m., as he walked past her desk to grab a folder, Clara said softly, without looking up, "You have a meeting with Mr. Barrett at 5. He usually likes a warm room. Conference B has better heating than A." Gregory stopped mid-step. She hadn't been asked. She hadn't been told to schedule the meeting, and she certainly wasn't expected to know Samuel Barrett's room preference. But she had known. He turned slightly, studied her face. Clara looked up, met his eyes not with challenge, but clarity, just trying to make the room work for the people in it. She said, then went back to typing. Gregory said nothing, but inside his chest, something flickered, something he hadn't felt in years. Not attraction, not admiration, something stranger, curiosity. He walked away, but slower this time, and for the first time since the morning, he looked back over his shoulder. She was still typing, still calm, still not afraid. He didn't know then that Clara Jennings had once stood in front of classrooms full of restless teenagers. He didn't know she had buried her only child 3 years ago. He didn't know that being unshaken by him wasn't courage, it was consequence. There are certain things in life that break you so deeply that no man, no matter how powerful, can scare you again. But all of that would come later. For now, she was just the new temp, and he was still the Ice King. But the temperature had begun to shift. Clara Jennings never planned to work at Langford Capital. She didn't read business news, didn't care about stocks, didn't know the difference between Series A or B funding. 5 years ago, she was standing at the front of a classroom in Oak Park, teaching Steinbeck and Sylvia Plath to 11th graders, wearing cardigans that smelled faintly of chalk and lavender, living in a world of literary metaphors and parent-teacher conferences. Her voice had once been warm, animated. She knew how to command attention without raising it. Clara was a good teacher, one of the best. And then, one rainy Sunday in March, her 6-year-old son, Ethan, didn't come home. A drunk driver ran a red light. A small blue backpack found crushed in the street. A single phone call. And Clara Jennings never stood in a classroom again. She didn't scream, didn't fall apart the way some people expected. She simply quieted. Grief didn't hit her like a wave. It seeped in like fog. Slow, heavy, unshakable. Her husband left 3 months later. Friends visited, then stopped. The silence grew until it was the only voice she heard. But Clara didn't die. She didn't disappear. She just shrank, folded herself into routine's grocery lists, folded towels, the hum of the kettle, and eventually, when the ache dulled enough for her to leave the house without crying, she applied to a temporary staffing agency, not because she wanted to start over, but because she was tired of talking to no one. At Langford Capital, Clara found a world ruled by unspoken rules and rehearsed smiles. Employees walked quickly, eyes forward. Phones were always in hand but never actually used for conversation. People didn't laugh. They nodded. You could tell the veterans by how quiet they were in elevators, by how quickly they cleared their desks after giving notice, by how they referred to Gregory Langford as him never by name. The air was crisp, the floor spotless. Everything ran on precision and pressure. And still. Clara wasn't intimidated, not because she was fearless, but because the worst thing had already happened. No man in a suit could hurt her more than fate already had. So she worked quietly, consistently. She remembered who drank tea instead of coffee. She learned the timing of when the copier jammed. She kept tissues in her drawer for interns who didn't want to be seen crying. She didn't join in on office gossip or venting in the break room. She didn't judge anyone for doing it either. She was simply there fully, gently, and without demand. On Thursday morning, a junior associate named Lacey passed Clara a file with trembling fingers. "Could you scan this before noon?" she asked, barely meeting Clara's gaze. Her voice was tight, scared. Clara nodded, and with a softness that made Lacey pause, said, "Take a deep breath. One mistake doesn't mean you're not good at what you do." It wasn't said to flatter. It wasn't said loudly. But Lacey blinked twice like she hadn't heard anything kind in weeks. And across the glass wall, Gregory Langford, who had just looked up from a morning report, watched the exchange. He didn't say anything, didn't react. But that afternoon, when he passed Clara's desk, and she quietly reminded him, "You skipped lunch again." Gregory paused, briefly, not because of the words, but because of how unaffected she was by his presence. Most people shrank when he approached. Clara didn't shrink. She didn't perform. She simply was. There was a gravity to her stillness. She didn't challenge him, but she didn't disappear either. And for a man surrounded by noise and strategy and power, her presence felt disarming. What Gregory couldn't see, what no one in that office could, was the invisible thread Clara carried every day. The photograph in her wallet, the locket around her neck she never took off, the way she always kept her inbox at zero, because the only message she ever missed, the one that would have warned her about Ethan's early school release, still haunted her in ways she never spoke aloud. She didn't need this job, but she needed a reason to put on shoes each morning, and sometimes that's enough to make a woman show up even to the 60th floor of a building run by fear. At 5 Zornser P, as the office lights dimmed and most employees began their quiet exits, Clara remained at her desk, organizing files Gregory hadn't asked for. He paused at his door again, noticing the small tray she had placed beside his inbox, color-coded, labeled, simplified. "Who told you to reorganize this?" he asked. Clara looked up, meeting his gaze. Her voice was calm. "No one. I just thought it might help." He didn't respond, but he didn't object either. And as he stepped into his elevator alone as always, he tapped the folder once against his palm. Something about her stuck, not loudly, but deeply, like a song you heard once and couldn't forget. By her 4th day at Langford Capital, Clara Jennings had learned more than most did in 4 months. She learned that the intern, Mia, never drank her coffee. It just gave her hands something to hold during meetings. That the head of HR always wore shoes 2 sizes too small, maybe to feel grounded. That the man in accounting, who nodded too much, whispered numbers to himself when no one watched. But more than anything, she noticed how people reacted whenever Gregory Langford walked by. The atmosphere shifted like air pressure before a storm. Voices dropped, laughter evaporated, cups were lowered quietly to desks, like children hiding candy before the teacher walked in. Clara began to call them the silent cups. Invisible moments of tension too small to be seen, but heavy enough to feel. In the elevators, people became statues. In meetings, they agreed quickly even when they looked unsure. And if Gregory frowned during a presentation, the presenter's eyes would flicker, then drop, like a flame smothered too fast. To Clara, it wasn't just fear, it was chronic survival. She didn't judge them. Fear had many forms. She remembered how she used to rehearse conversations with Ethan's pediatrician, terrified of saying the wrong thing, how she'd freeze at the sound of a phone ringing. Years after that call, people coped in strange ways. Sometimes silence was safer than sincerity. But what caught her off guard was how easy it was to go invisible in a room full of noise. On Friday morning, Gregory arrived earlier than usual. He slammed a folder on his desk loud enough that even the assistant 3 doors down flinched. Who approved this version of the revenue forecast? He muttered, pacing. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. His words were like frost they cracked, then spread. He buzzed Clara through the intercom. She entered the room calmly, a legal pad in one hand, pen already clicked open. "Did you review this file before it was finalized?" he asked, not looking at her. "No, sir. It came through another department. But may I take a look now?" He handed her the folder without another word. She flipped through quickly, line after line, calculation after calculation. Then, with barely a pause, she reached into her notebook, tore out a small sheet, and wrote page 4, line 17. Sales projection assumes 2 facilities that were sold last quarter. She placed it on the folder and slid it back toward him. Gregory glanced at the note, then looked at her. "You're sure Clara didn't blink?" "Yes." A long pause filled the room. He took the folder, stared at the page, then without saying thank you or admitting the mistake, he simply nodded once, more to himself than to her. "Good catch." She left the room quietly. No one had ever handed him a correction like that before. Certainly not a secretary, and definitely not on a scrap of paper. That afternoon, Gregory found himself watching her more closely, not suspiciously, not even consciously at first. But when she moved through the office efficient, focused, he realized something odd. Clara wasn't intimidated by him, but she also didn't try to impress him. She didn't try to be memorable, and somehow that made her unforgettable. Later that day, Clara passed by the break room and saw Lacey, the nervous junior associate, staring into her coffee, untouched. The cup trembled slightly in her hands. Clara walked in, not saying a word, and simply poured a fresh cup, placed it gently next to Lacey, and whispered, "Try decaf next time. It might help the hands." Lacey smiled, a small breath of relief escaping her lips. It wasn't just the joke, it was the kindness, quiet, unasked for, and undeserved. Across the hallway, Gregory happened to look up from his screen. He saw the moment, the smile, the calming, and for a second he wondered, why did everyone else move around him with fear? But she moved with care. That evening, as the office emptied and city lights began to flicker across the windows, Gregory walked past Clara's desk. He paused. She was organizing printed files into labeled trays she had brought from home. "Most people don't last long in this job," he said, flatly. Clara didn't look up. "I'm not most people." He studied her for a beat. "You're not afraid of me." It wasn't a question. "Still," she answered, gently, "No. But I do believe in being careful." He let out something close to a breath of amusement. Almost. Then asked, "What made you notice the error this morning?" She met his gaze, "Because it didn't feel right. And when things don't feel right, I double-check. That's how I live now." There was a weight in her voice that Gregory couldn't name, but it made him stop, just for a moment. When he stepped into his office, he saw the scrap note again on his desk. Handwritten, neat, no frills. He picked it up, folded it, and slipped it into the top drawer. He didn't know why, but something told him he'd want to remember it later. The file arrived on Gregory's desk with a red tab and the word confidential stamped clean across the top. Meridian Biotech acquisition. Internal briefing. A multi-million-dollar deal. On paper. A gold mine. Projected to expand Langford Capital's reach into pharmaceutical innovation, with lucrative patents and government contracts lined up, the board was thrilled. The lawyers had already begun drafting. But Clara, sitting quietly at her desk with a copy of the support documents, noticed something that didn't sit right. It started as a line item buried in Appendix C, something about deferred lease obligations on 2 inactive subsidiaries. She blinked, reread, pulled out her calculator. Something was missing. She didn't speak up immediately. That wasn't her way. Instead, that evening, while the office buzzed with late-night preparations, Clara sat in the tiny break room with a legal pad, drawing, circles, arrows, dates. She mapped out a flow of assets and debts like a teacher sketching a logic problem for high schoolers. Simple lines, clear symbols, firm handwriting. She double-checked the numbers with public records. What she saw made her chest tighten. Meridian Biotech wasn't just inflating their valuation. They were using dormant entities to mask $18 million in unsecured debt. Debt that, after the merger, would belong to Langford Capital. It wasn't fraud in the legal sense, but it was misleading enough to collapse the deal and maybe the company's public trust if it came out later. The next morning, Clara walked into Gregory's office before he called her. That alone was unusual. She carried the legal pad in both hands. No files, no coffee, just the pad. "I think there's something you need to see." Gregory looked up, halfway through an espresso. He raised an eyebrow, but motioned for her to continue. Clara laid the pad on his desk and stepped back. The hand-drawn diagram wasn't fancy. No color coding, no slide formatting, just truth. Gregory leaned in, studying the web of connections. "Where did you get this all-public filings? Page 17 in their March disclosure contradicts what's on record with the SEC. Look here." She pointed to the dotted line. These 2 subsidiaries were liquidated last year. They shouldn't still be reporting asset flow through them. Gregory frowned. "And how do you know how to read this? I used to teach advanced logic and research analysis," she said simply. Old habits. He was quiet for a long time, then closed the folder on his desk. "I have a board meeting in 30. Sit in?" Clara blinked. "Sir, bring the pad." When she entered the boardroom, 7 men in tailored suits and 1 woman in a crisp gray dress barely looked up. They had seen her before in passing. Another assistant, another temp. They assumed she was there to take notes. Gregory didn't introduce her. He simply opened the meeting and passed the pad down the table. "This is a risk analysis on the Meridian deal," he said. "It came across my desk this morning." One of the board members, Samuel Barrett, scanned the page and frowned. "Where's this from? Legal didn't submit this." Gregory looked at Clara, then back at the board. "It's from Ms. Jennings." A pause, a beat longer than it needed to be. Barrett scoffed slightly. "Your secretary, Gregory, didn't blink. She caught something our analysts missed." The room fell silent. Clara stood, hands calmly folded, eyes steady. Another board member cleared his throat. "With respect, Greg, we don't take merger advice from temporary hires." Still, Gregory said nothing, but instead of taking the pad back, he tapped the table gently, signaling they should keep reading. And they did. 20 minutes later, no one laughed. Questions flew around the table. "How do we verify this? Does this change the EBITDA calculations?" What else could be buried? Clara answered each one, softly but clearly. She referenced documents, quoted filings, connected dates. She wasn't loud, she wasn't boastful, but her words landed harder than any presentation the board had sat through in years. Because she wasn't trying to impress. She was trying to protect the company. After the meeting, Clara quietly gathered her pad and stepped out without a word. She didn't wait to be thanked. She didn't expect it. That night, Gregory sat alone in his office, her drawing laid flat on his desk. He had watched boardrooms go silent before plenty of times, but never like that. Never for someone with no title, no power, no agenda. He turned the pad slightly, looking at her handwriting. And for the first time in his career, he wondered how many times had he dismissed truth, just because of the hands that carried it in the drawer next to him, folded beside the first scrap note she had written days ago. He slipped the page in carefully. Then he turned out the light. Because Gregory Langford wasn't sure who Clara Jennings really was. But she was clearly more than a secretary. The following Monday morning, the sky over Chicago was gray and undecided, hovering between rain and fog. Gregory stood by the window of his office, a coffee cooling in his hand. He wasn't reading reports. He wasn't reviewing numbers. He was thinking about Clara, about her hand-drawn diagram, the way her voice had calmly dismantled a multi-million-dollar illusion in the boardroom, and about how, when the meeting ended, she didn't stay behind for praise. She just picked up her legal pad and left. That kind of clarity didn't come from ambition. It came from something older, deeper. He turned from the window, buzzed her desk. "Ms. Jennings, please join me, and bring your notes." Clara walked in, as she always did, measured, quiet, present. She carried the same worn notebook and a folder that looked like it had lived in a teacher's satchel more than a corporate office. "No slides?" Gregory asked. Clara blinked once. Expression neutral. "I find paper harder to ignore." He nodded, almost smiling. "I want you to present this to a few people. Analysts. Legal. I want their reaction firsthand." Her brows lifted, just slightly. "I'm not a financial advisor." "No," Gregory said, "but you're the only one who noticed the hole before we fell into it." The room was smaller this time. Intimate. Just 4 people, a senior partner from legal, 2 financial analysts, and Gregory himself. None of them had met Clara beyond a hallway glance. They expected a junior associate, a data-laden slideshow, an over-polished pitch. Instead, Clara stood at the head of the table with 3 sheets of paper, a pencil, and no apology. "Good morning," she said. "I'll keep this simple." She walked them through the structure she had mapped. Circles for shell companies, arrows for fund movement, asterisks beside key filings. Her voice was steady, calm, but behind it was something unmistakable, quiet conviction. No theatrics, no dramatics. Just, "This is what I saw. Here's why it matters." One of the analysts, young Sharp, clearly not thrilled, leaned back and said, "This feels like a stretch." "Are you a CPA?" noted. Clara replied, "I taught literature and logic for 12 years, but I learned early on that numbers, like words, can lie if you don't read them in context." The room fell still for a beat. Gregory, watching from the corner, felt it. That moment when resistance gives way to recognition. The legal partner leaned forward. "Where did you get these documents? All public. I can forward the links. And what's your recommendation?" "Not mine to give," Clara said softly. "But if this deal closes and the debt surfaces later, it won't just be a financial setback. It'll be a breach of trust." She paused. Langford Capital has power, but people remember integrity longer than influence. When the meeting ended, the legal partner stayed behind. "She's not wrong," he said to Gregory. "We'd better halt the review." Quietly. The 2 analysts left, murmuring between themselves, less defensive now, more concerned. Clara gathered her papers. As she turned to leave, Gregory said quietly, "Wait." She stopped, He stood, walked to the head of the table, and faced her. "You know what most people do when they want to be noticed?" he asked. "They decorate the truth," she replied. Gregory gave a small nod. "And you didn't?" "I don't need to be noticed, Mr. Langford," she said. "I just need things to make sense." Then she left the room. The next day, the board reconvened, this time in the main conference hall. Tension ran high. Word had spread. Clara's name was murmured in hushed tones. Some saw her as a risk, others a disruption. Gregory stood at the head of the table. "We're suspending the Meridian deal until further notice," he said flatly. Barrett frowned. Because of her, she brought forward concerns worth verifying. Gregory replied, "She's not even staff." Another board member snapped, "She's a secretary." That word hung in the air, sharp, loaded, diminishing, and for the first time, Gregory didn't just brush it off. He stood still, looked each man in the eye, then said, in a voice firm, "But even I trust the person who sees what no one else does." The room went silent. No rebuttal. No counter. Because when Gregory Langford spoke with certainty, people listened. But what surprised them all was why he believed this time. Not numbers, not titles, but instinct. And that instinct pointed directly to Clara Jennings. Later that afternoon, Gregory passed her desk. He didn't speak, just placed a fresh legal pad next to her old one. At the top, in his handwriting, "Keep seeing." No signature, no explanation. Clara glanced up. Their eyes met briefly. Not a smile, not a thank you. Just something quieter. Respect. That evening, as the last of the city lights blinked on and cleaners shuffled through the halls, Gregory remained in his office, leaning back in his chair. He wasn't thinking about reports or deals. He was thinking about the silence Clara carried like armor and the truth she delivered without raising her voice. In his world, influence usually came dressed in confidence, polished, packaged. But somehow, hers came wrapped in stillness, and it had done what no advisor, no strategist ever had. It made him listen. There were many things Gregory Langford didn't know about Clara Jennings. That had never bothered him before. He didn't make a habit of learning about employees' personal lives. In his world, efficiency mattered more than origin stories. But lately, curiosity had crept in quietly, like a breeze slipping through a barely cracked window. It wasn't just the way Clara worked. It was the weight behind her silence. The kind that didn't come from shyness, but from something much older, much deeper. She didn't speak unless necessary, but when she did, people listened. And now, Gregory wanted to know why. On a rare Thursday, without back-to-back meetings, he asked Lacey under the guise of reviewing HR files where Clara had worked before. An Oak Park public school, she said, scrolling, Eastmore High, English department. He thanked her with a nod, then stepped into his car that Saturday morning, not entirely sure what he was looking for. Eastmore High sat on the edge of a tree-lined suburb, its brick facade softened by ivy and decades of memories. It wasn't a prestigious school, no banners of national merit or athletic championships, but there was something settled about it, lived in. Gregory walked through the front doors slowly, unannounced. He didn't wear his tailored suit that day. No tie. Just a navy sweater and jeans. Still out of place, but less so. The front desk secretary looked up. "May I help you? I'm trying to find someone who knew Clara Jennings," he said. Her expression changed instantly. "She used to teach here. Before." A pause. "She left a few years ago." "Do you know someone I could talk to?" 10 minutes later, he was sitting in the staff lounge across from a woman with graying curls and kind, perceptive eyes. Donna Pierce. Retired now, but had once shared the classroom next to Clara's. She never just taught books, Donna said, stirring her tea. She taught kids how to feel seen, how to speak when their homes were silent. Gregory listened quietly. "I remember one student," she continued, "a boy who stuttered badly, wouldn't read aloud. Clara gave him extra time, let him write instead. By the end of the year, he stood up in front of the class and read a poem he wrote himself." She smiled. Clara clapped the loudest. Gregory leaned in. Why did she leave? Donna's smile faded. She lost her son. A long silence stretched between them. She took a short leave at first. We all thought she'd come back. The classroom waited for her. Her books stayed on the shelves for months. But Donna's voice softened. She never returned. Gregory walked the halls afterward. Posters still lined the walls. A smell of pencil shavings and printer ink lingered in the air. Outside, he found a row of benches under a maple tree just beginning to turn gold with fall. He sat nearby. There was a small student garden marked with painted stones. One stone caught his eye. Blue, faded. "Mrs. Jennings taught me how to be brave with words. C. J. Class of 2015. He read it 3 times. A simple tribute. But to Gregory, it thundered louder than any plaque on a boardroom wall. Because in that moment, he understood something he never had before. Clara hadn't stopped teaching. She had just changed classrooms. Back in the car, Gregory sat for a while before starting the engine. He thought about all the resumes he'd ever seen polished, rehearsed, lifeless, and how Clara's never made it to his desk because she hadn't come for recognition. She had come for quiet, and somehow she'd made that quiet powerful. That night, he didn't go over quarterly projections, didn't review the analyst reports waiting on his desk. He sat in his apartment, lights dimmed, and thought about grief, not as a weakness, but as a weight that shapes people in ways no education or title ever could. The next morning, Clara arrived to find a single note on her desk, folded, unsigned. Some people lead with volume. You lead with stillness. Thank you for showing me the difference. She didn't ask who wrote it. She didn't need to. She placed the note gently into her notebook between pages filled with diagrams, timelines, and a pencil sketch of a bench under a tree. And then, as always, she went back to work. The invitation came in the most unremarkable way. No formal tone, no company letterhead, just Gregory pausing by Clara's desk as she archived quarterly reports and saying, almost casually, "There's a place across the river quiet. Good food. Join me after work." Clara looked up, searching his face for formality or motive. There was none, only a flicker of something unspoken. She nodded once. All right. The restaurant sat on the edge of the Chicago River, tucked between a bookstore and a vintage music shop. Warm lights, no music. Brick walls that made every sound feel like a whisper. They sat by the window, no tablecloths, no one taking pictures of their plates. For a man like Gregory, it was a rare kind of space, one that didn't care who he was. Clara ordered tea. Gregory, black coffee. No small talk. It wasn't awkward, just honest. A few minutes passed before Gregory finally asked, "Why are you here?" Clara blinked. He clarified, "Not here. Tonight. I mean at Langford Capital." Why this job? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down at her tea, watching the steam rise and swirl like breath from an invisible mouth. Then, quietly, Because routine keeps me from falling apart. Gregory didn't move, didn't blink. Clara continued, her voice soft but steady. Because being needed, even for something small, like fixing a calendar or catching a typo, makes the silence at home feel less cruel. She didn't say it to evoke pity. She said it like someone describing the weather matter of fact, inevitable. Because I know what happens when grief has nowhere to go. It starts folding you in on yourself. So I get up. I get dressed. I go somewhere I'm expected. And that's enough. For now. The server came to refill water glasses. Neither of them noticed. Gregory had sat through hundreds of business dinners. He had heard men lie through their teeth. He had seen people spin pain into polished narratives. But Clara didn't spin. She let her truth sit on the table unadorned, unguarded. And it did something to him that no negotiation or confession ever had. It made him feel still. For a moment, he forgot the stock prices, the investors, the board's cold stares. He remembered a hospital waiting room instead, his mother's face as the doctor closed the door. The sound of his father's shoes tapping against linoleum. Too fast, too loud, too late. He remembered not knowing what to say, how silence, for the first time in his life, had swallowed him whole. He looked at Clara now, and something softened, not on his face, but in his chest. "No one ever tells you," he said quietly, "that success doesn't shield you from loneliness. It just gives you more places to hide it." Clara looked at him then, not surprised, not curious, just open. They didn't talk much after that. They didn't need to. The city lights danced across their table. Strangers laughed softly at nearby tables. But their corner remained untouched by noise. They paid in silence, walked out into the chill of early evening without rushing. Outside, by the river. Gregory stopped. His hands were in his coat pockets, his shoulders slightly hunched, not from the cold, but something heavier. "I didn't ask you here to pry," he said. Clara nodded, and I didn't answer to impress. They shared a quiet smile. Thin, fleeting, but real. She glanced at the water. "You ever wonder if some people are just meant to survive, not shine?" Gregory was quiet. "Then I think some people shine in ways that don't blind. They warm." Clara said nothing, but her breath caught slightly. That was enough. When they parted ways at the corner, there was no promise of another dinner, no invitation back to his place, no lingering stares. Just a soft, "Good night, Clara," and her reply, "Good night, Gregory." Two names, finally spoken without titles. Two lives, once sharp and frayed, now gently stitched together, not by romance, not yet, but by something rarer, recognition. The office was nearly empty by 9:45 p.m. Most floors of Langford Capital had gone dark, just the cleaning crews and the occasional flicker of monitors left behind in rush. But on the 60th floor, two lights still glowed, one over Gregory's glass-walled office and the other above Clara's desk. Gregory stood at the whiteboard, sleeves rolled, tie draped over the back of his chair. Clara sat cross-legged on the floor, notepad in hand, a pizza box open between them. They weren't working late because of a deadline. They were working late because something had finally come alive. It started with a simple question. That morning, Gregory had asked Clara almost offhand what she thought of a new healthcare investment opportunity. "It's profitable," she said. "But would you put your mother in one of their care facilities?" Gregory had paused, blinked. He hadn't thought about it that way. He hadn't thought about his mother in years. By noon, Clara was outlining a new approach to investments, guided not just by market projections, but by human consequence. "What if," she said, tapping her pen against her notes, "we prioritize companies that treat people right, even if the margins aren't as sharp?" Gregory scoffed at first. Investors don't pay for kindness. But she just looked at him. "Don't they?" Her tone wasn't defiant. It was honest. That evening, he canceled his dinner reservation and asked her to stay. Now, hours later, the whiteboard behind him was crowded with arrows and handwritten notes, transparent labor practices, affordable long-term outcomes, generational impact, quarterly return. Gregory, for the first time in his professional life, wasn't directing. He was being led. And surprisingly, he didn't mind. Clara stood and joined him at the board, reading one of her scribbled phrases aloud. "Do good, then do well." Gregory laughed an actual laugh. "Sounds like a bumper sticker." "Maybe," Clara said with a smile. "But what if it's true?" He looked at her, then not like a CEO sizing up a proposal, but like a man seeing something in someone he hadn't seen in years. Not competence, not loyalty, but clarity. Around 11 p.m., Clara slid to the floor again, arms draped over her knees. "You know," she said, reaching for a slice of cold pizza, "the last time I stayed up this late, I was building a cardboard solar system with Ethan. He thought Pluto should still count." Gregory sat beside her, carefully, like the moment might break. "He's right," Gregory said. "No one likes being demoted." Clara let out a soft, surprised laugh. Gregory smiled. It was the first time he'd heard that sound from her, and it felt like home. Not a place. A moment where neither of them had to pretend. There were no contracts between them, no implied promises. Just two people, long practiced in loneliness, now collaborating in the dark not to fill silence, but to give it meaning. Gregory looked up at the board again, then at Clara, sitting beside him in worn heels and ink-stained fingers. "I've run this company for almost 2 decades," he said, "but tonight it feels like I just started understanding what it's for." Clara didn't say anything right away. She reached into her bag, pulled out a small sticky note, and wrote something. Then, carefully, she placed it at the center of the whiteboard. "You don't need saving. Gregory, you just needed someone to sit beside you in the dark." He stared at the note, not because it was dramatic, but because it was precisely true. All these years, Gregory had built empires out of silence, intimidation disguised as control, distance as a leadership tactic. But Clara didn't try to fix him. She simply sat beside him, and in that stillness, something uncurled inside him, something almost forgotten. Relief. They didn't talk much after that. The clock moved past midnight. The board faded behind layers of tired laughter and half-finished diagrams. At 12:27, Clara gathered her things. Gregory walked her to the elevator, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. At the doors, she looked at him and said softly, "You'll forget most of what we wrote tonight by morning." He tilted his head, "But you'll remember how it felt." Then she stepped inside. No hug, no promise, no plan. Just that feeling, something settling, not ending. Gregory didn't go back to his office. He stayed by the whiteboard, staring at the sticky note. His empire would still be there tomorrow, but for now, in this sleepless night, he had found something rarer than power. He had found peace. The late afternoon sun filtered softly through Clara's apartment window, casting golden streaks across her bookshelf and the faded fabric of her old reading chair. It was Sunday. Quiet. A record hummed faintly in the background. Ella Fitzgerald. gentle as breath. Clara sat curled up with a worn paperback, glasses slipping slightly down her nose, legs tucked beneath her. There were no meetings, no whiteboards, no timelines, just peace. And for the first time in years, that peace didn't feel borrowed. It felt like hers. A soft knock on the door. She opened it to find Gregory standing there, no suit, no briefcase, just a navy wool coat and something unreadable in his eyes, and a small box in his hand. Clara's breath caught. She didn't speak. Neither did he. Not yet. He stepped in. Quietly. The door shut behind him like a soft promise. For a moment, they just stood there. No rush, no ceremony. Gregory looked around the space books stacked unevenly. A plant too tall for its corner. A framed photo of a boy with Clara's eyes beside a mug of cold tea. He took a breath. Not the kind meant to impress. The kind meant to steady. Then, simply, "I've built towers all my life." His voice wasn't grand. It wasn't rehearsed. It was true. Towers that reach high, that people point at, that make the skyline prettier. He looked at her, but none of them ever felt like home. He opened the small box. Inside, a ring, simple, classic. A single diamond resting in a setting of brushed gold, understated like everything she was. "With you, Clara, I don't want to build another tower. I want to build a home." Silence, but not the kind they once feared. This one was holy, full, whole. Clara didn't reach for the ring. She reached for his hand first, held it like it was something both fragile and familiar. Then, tears began to well quiet, unannounced. She laughed once, barely audible, brushing her cheek with her free hand. "No one's ever said that to me." He didn't rush her. He didn't fill the space, because the truth had already been spoken. After a moment, she looked at him, eyes full, voice shaking, but firm. Yes. Then again, like it had lived in her chest all this time. Waiting. Always. Yes. Gregory slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that had once signed billion-dollar deals, but had never shaken quite like this. Not from nerves, but from feeling. He held her close, not as possession, not as rescue, but as recognition. Two lives once wrapped in solitude, now quietly overlapping. They sat together for a while on the old couch she'd had since her teaching days, with springs that creaked if you moved too fast. No need for champagne, just tea, and her leaning against his shoulder, and the city glowing softly beyond the window. He reached for the book she'd been reading. "Wolf?" he asked, glancing at the cover. She nodded. He opened to a dog-eared page, underlined in neat pencil. "To love makes one solitary." She smiled. "I think I used to believe that." Gregory looked at her, gently brushing a thumb over her hand. "Do you still?" She didn't answer with words. She just leaned in, forehead resting against his. And in that stillness, they both understood love didn't erase solitude. It just meant someone else was willing to sit with you in it. That evening, when Gregory left, he didn't look back down the hallway. He didn't need to. Because now, for the first time in his life, he wasn't leaving a building behind. He was leaving towards something. A year had passed, not in grand declarations, not in sudden changes, but in small shifts, like light moving across a room. Gregory Langford still wore navy suits, still arrived at the office at 7:00 sharp, still commanded a company that shaped industries. But now, he listened. Every Monday morning, he walked through the bullpen, not just to be seen, but to ask. Quietly, "How are you holding up?" He had learned to wait for the real answer. He no longer finished people's sentences. no longer spoke to impress. And when meetings grew tense, he reached for the same tool Clara had once used, a sticky note. Simple, direct, human. Clara Jennings had long ago turned down the offer of a corner office. She kept the same small workspace, same desk, same corkboard filled with handwritten ideas. Even after the board officially named her Strategic Human Impact Advisor, a title crafted to mean almost nothing, and yet, to her, meant everything. Because it wasn't about power. It was about being needed, and using that need to shape something better. The biggest shift came not in a quarterly report, but in a quiet initiative launched without press, the Clara Jennings Scholarship Fund, a full-ride award for students pursuing teaching, social work, or community health, especially those who had lost someone. The board hadn't voted on it. Gregory had funded it himself. "I owe my clarity," he'd said in the announcement, "to someone who never raised her voice, but helped me hear what matters." Lacey, the once timid junior associate, had grown into a confident team lead. Barrett from the board had quietly retired. And the whiteboard in Gregory's office now bore phrases no analyst would have written 5 years ago. Empathy scales, long-term trust, sustainable growth. Ask, then answer. The culture at Langford Capital didn't change overnight, but it changed. And Clara, with her notebooks and gentle eyes, had become something no policy could replicate, the conscience of a company. One November afternoon, the city was brushed in gold and auburn. The last of the leaves danced down Michigan Avenue. Gregory had no meetings that day. He walked with Clara to Lincoln Park, 2 cups of cider in hand, the wind soft but persistent. They didn't speak much, just walked. They found their bench, the one under the maple tree, the one Clara used to sit on alone. Now, it had a small plaque, "For those who teach us how to listen just by being." She hadn't known Gregory had it installed. She ran her fingers over the engraving slowly, then looked at him with eyes full, not of tears, but of something even rarer. Peace. They sat. Cars moved in the distance. Children's laughter floated from the playground. The breeze carried the smell of cinnamon and early snow. And in that still, golden quiet, Gregory spoke. "Do you remember the first time we met?" Clara smirked. "You didn't look at me once. I was afraid of what you'd see," he said. She turned to him, voice steady. "And now I hope you never stop seeing." He reached for her hand, not with urgency, but with reverence. They sat in silence, their fingers laced, the kind of silence not made of absence, but of understanding. There had been no dramatic confrontations, no enemies to vanquish, just 2 lives, stitched together across sleepless nights, lost sons, broken pride, and a shared hunger to be useful again. Gregory had built towers, but in Clara he found something rarer than legacy. He found home. And Clara, who once believed her days of purpose were buried with her child, had discovered, through Gregory, that impact wasn't about being loud, it was about being steady. As the sun dipped lower and the wind carried whispers through the trees, a narrator might have said she didn't just silence him, she helped him hear what truly matters. But no narrator spoke. Only the wind, only the city, only 2 people, quiet but mighty. As we grow older, we often learn that the loudest voices aren't always the wisest, and that the greatest changes sometimes begin in silence. This story reminds us that healing doesn't always come from grand gestures. Sometimes it arrives in a quiet room, through someone simply choosing to stay. Gregory had all the success the world could offer, yet what truly transformed him wasn't wealth or influence, but one woman's steady presence and quiet courage. Clara didn't try to fix him. She didn't need to be right. She just listened, And in doing so, she gave him space to become someone better. In our own lives, maybe we don't need to be strong all the time. Maybe we don't need answers, just someone who sees us without judgment. So today, whether you're the one carrying grief or the one sitting beside it, remember kindness matters, presence matters, and even the softest voices can leave the deepest echoes. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue telling stories that heal, connect, and inspire. Every share brings light to someone who may need it today. From all of us at Shining Stories, thank you for being here.